Well, good day to you. Not certain if it's good morning or good afternoon, but a very big welcome to this discussion about the book, my book, called The Optimum You. Now, my name is Duncan Christie Miller, and I'm the author of this book. And I'm joined today in a discussion by Dr. Michael Vaughan and Tim Isaac. Tim Isaac is a fellow member of the Roehampton Club, and Dr. Michael Vaughan and myself, well, we were at school together. We're old friends and we go back a long way. Now, the fact that they're both good friends of mine doesn't mean to say they're going to give me an easy time on this discussion, because I know they've got a number of penetrating questions for me and observations about this book. But let me set the scene as to why we are here today. This book was compiled over many years. It's the sum, as it were, of 28 workbooks which I've written as part of my training and coaching business. And I put them together into the Optimum You this time last year during lockdown. And it's been published by Troubadour. And at the moment, I'm glad to say that it is selling extremely well. So the first good news, as it were, is the Optimum You. I'm very optimistic about it. So what I want to do now is to get our discussion underway. And I'm first of all going to ask Tim Isaac to set the scene, lead off as to why we're here and what his first questions are about the Optimum You book. So Tim, over to you.
Well, we're here obviously in order to ask you demanding questions, which will give you an opportunity to share what the values of this book could be for anyone who buys it, either for themselves at any age, frankly, it seems to me, having read it, or indeed for other people that they might give it to. So my first question, though, is you mentioned there about your mentoring and coaching over many years and as a business, and quite a successful one. So this, it seems to me, has been based a lot on those experiences. And I wondered if you could share with us a couple of case histories that sort of stick in your mind as being examples of just how useful this kind of mentoring and coaching can be.
Thank you. One particularly comes to mind, which was for, I was running the management training for the RNLI, the lifeboat people. And down in Poole, where the headquarters is based, there were two very senior executives. One was an ex-Royal Navy engineering officer, and the other was an ex-Merchant Navy operations officer. And they were absolutely different characters, and they weren't getting on. The ironic thing about their relationship was their wives were very good friends. But these two were completely at odds with each other. The Royal Navy officer thought that the Merchant Navy officer, all his plans were on the back of an envelope. He wasn't accurate. And the Merchant Navy officer thought this guy was an over-pedantic stick in the mud.
I imagine both of them were correct, by the way.
Probably more than likely, yeah. And I took them through a sequence of events, which in the book is referred to as the mirror technique. And this is when you sit opposite each other with a mentor guide, and you ask the question to yourself, what does the other person, what do I think the other person thinks of me? And you write them down, and then you share them. And where there is agreement, you don't discuss that. But where there is disagreement, you discuss it. So what we're moving people towards is behaving like adults, rather like, unlike a parent and a child, or a child and a parent. You're trying to get people to have an open and frank discussion and to actually tell the other person what they really think. So there's no opportunity for obfuscation or avoidance. Well, with these two, we actually started about 8 o'clock in the evening. After a couple of hours, we had a meal. We resumed later on, and we finished at 3 o'clock in the morning. At which stage, I must say that I was yawning with my mouth shut and trying to keep it going. But at the end of the day, the result was really beneficial. They're never going to be great friends. But what they learned to do was to work together positively.
So a couple of words which come to my mind from you telling me about that case history, which do feature here a lot, is first of all, listen, really listen. And secondly is respect, which usually comes as a result of listening rather than just assuming the other person
Indeed.
is
No, it's a well-made point.
very ridiculous.
But in the book, there is a thing about active listening, using one of my favorite mnemonics, which is glass rims, which is the sequence of event about giving feedback and actually listening and asking sequential questions. But of course, most men, as I am now, prefer to talk rather than listen. And it's a very good skill for us to acquire, the ability to listen. But this book is based not on my medical knowledge or my psychology knowledge, because I don't have that. It's based on experience, hard-won experience, things I've learned by not getting things right and sometimes getting them right. I'm very proud of the mirror technique because I invented that, and I found it to be extremely useful. Michael, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Duncan. When you told me you'd written this potential bestseller, you didn't send me a copy through the post. I went to Amazon and bought it.
Oh, thank you.
And interestingly, I read it twice. And the first time I read it, I got a pretty good idea of the sort of book it was. It was not one of these books that was filling a gap. It was not descending into psychobabble. As you say, it was actually a very practical book. Easy to read, very concise. And it's the sort of book which you really need to go back, keep going back and reading something again. So I was wondering where you thought you were pitching this book. Where is the gap that you were trying to fill, if indeed that's what you were trying to do?
Very much so, thank you. The gap is this. I think that most of the self-help books which I've read in the past have wanted to turn me into some sort of Superman. And I just didn't register with that. And I wanted to write a book that you could dip into and dip out of and enjoy and give away as a present to people who might be going through a midlife crisis or a moment in time when they were looking to create the future. And to do so in a very practical, homely way, not trying to make everything appear to be extremely difficult or to use superlatives, but to get people to understand that all of us have got latent talent, and it makes life much more worthwhile if we can develop that talent within our own framework, not according to what for somebody else's standards, but how we can incrementally improve ourselves, not trying to be a super person.
I think what also comes across in the book is that you're very conscious or subconscious about the needs of other people. And I think that came across very strongly in this book, where you sat down and wrote a letter to your 6 grandchildren. I thought that was quite powerful, because you were actually, without preaching at them, you were actually giving them a structure, because you were saying that throughout life, you're going to have developed certain beliefs. You'll have certain experiences. But how are you actually going to put a structure around that so that it optimizes you, so that you get the best out of life, so you don't flounder looking for signposts? And I think that was one of the things that came across. What prompted you to write this very personal letter to your 6 grandchildren?
It was prompted by the fact that I never saw them individually. I always saw them inside a family group. And that was, there was artificial cheerfulness and sort of ebullience about the whole thing. And I wanted to get them to respond to me so I could actually create a dialogue with them and not have a collective where we are operating. And it's based on the value of wisdom. And it comes back to one of my central beliefs about knowledge and confidence,
Yes.
and that knowledge breeds confidence. And when I was growing up, although have always been a very assertive and superficially very confident person, but there were moments when I did lack assertiveness and confidence because I didn't have the knowledge. So this was a gesture of trying to accelerate them in their teenage years so that they would emerge from that very difficult period with more confidence based on knowledge.
So this kind of makes me think about a particular theme that runs throughout a bit. And I'd be interested to know whether I've got the right end of the stick here, that it's not prescriptive in terms of directions about you should do this and not that. It's very much helping people to be aware of themselves and their own strengths and indeed weaknesses, and to live with those and to build their strengths and opportunities on the basis of good self-awareness. So from within, in other words.
Sure. I think that's very insightful. I often ask people, and it's a very interesting question, I think, to ask people, who are you? And on most occasions, most people, especially men, are unable to answer that question. They tell me what they do. They're not able to tell me who they actually are. And it took me a long time to work out what are my major characteristics. One of them is that I'm intensely curious. And I every single day, I say that's interesting at least 20, 30, 40, 50 times. I'm curious. So if somebody asks me who I am, one of my characteristics is I'm curious. I do think that if you're going to motivate and lead other people, you have to start with knowing who you are. And I've got a favorite question at the moment as well, in addition to who are you, which is, of these three elements, which has been the most influential in your life? Your family, your school, or your post-school career? And most people, when they think about it, say, well, it's a bit of all three. But I've actually had some very interesting discussions where people say, well, actually, my family influenced me negatively. My school influenced me positively, but my business life and my post-career and my post-academic life has really balanced it out and made me the person who I am. So this book was designed to encapsulate that understanding of who you are, and therefore that gives you a sense of what you might be able to achieve.
I see one of the strengths of the book, as far as I see it, taking it forward from what you were saying, Tim, is actually based on a lot of practical experience, and it doesn't descend at any time into what sometimes is referred to as psychobabble. I think it's often a mistake, these sort of books, they try to justify themselves by medicalizing it, which is a mistake because it's not a medical issue. Is there anything that you think you could have done better or you would do next time differently?
Very much so. I think the lesson, the major lesson I've learned from this positively is that people's attention span for books like this is quite limited, and therefore it has to be kept brief and short and succinct. So
Yes.
I've learned that lesson positively.
Right.
From the things that I would like to incorporate into the next book is really aiming it more accurately at a segment of society rather than the generality, which this is. And the segment I'm going to be aiming for is people who are in their midlife. And I don't call it a midlife crisis, I call it a midlife opportunity. And that's what I've learned, is to make the book more pointed at a particular segment who I think are really in need of some form of direction, but not making it didactic or autocratic.
So it's going to be based largely on experience again.
Yes, because I'm now 77.
Yes.
And I've been through that period. At the age of 40, I had my midlife opportunity.
Yes.
And I moved on from my career, which I was enjoying, but my eyes had been opened by an outside agency to show me what other possibilities existed. Up until that time, I had no idea or very little contact with XYZ, and I was stuck in my very enjoyable rut. And I was opened up, my eyes were opened, and I could see there were other things which I wanted to explore. And I think that is one aspect of the book I'm proud of. It does, I hope it gives people a vision of what they themselves can move on to.
Okay, so I mean, you normally talk about sort of the evidence based of things. How are you going to generate the evidence that this book has actually worked for people? Is it anecdotal, or are you going to be asking questions and evaluating the responses?
Very nice question. The answer is I'm a great enthusiast for feedback. And you don't get feedback, for example, when my publisher doesn't give me feedback. He just tells me how many books have been sold, but there's no actual feedback. So what I'm hoping from this interview, this period today, is that in the future, I will be able to have a review session, a feedback session with people from the Roehampton Club who have bought it, and we could generate a discussion with and from them. But the thing I learned over the years, and it's very useful for people in all walks of life, is not to have the dreaded Monday morning management meeting, but to have a review of progress, not run by the director or the boss, but run by a member of the team. And then you really get some proper feedback, and people feed upwards what they are really, if it's handled properly, it becomes an open discussion and people give you that feedback.
I'd quite like to go back to that point about midlife, which opportunity, because it seems to me that the way the world has evolved, actually midlife for an awful lot of people in real practical terms, and the change involved in midlife opportunity starts at about the age of 22 and continues almost indefinitely until people are too old to be bothered to think or be curious any longer. In other words, it's a very, very broad period. It's not one point in your life from 22 to 65 retirement age.
I think two aspects there. Firstly, many people have moved away from the idea of a career for life, and they're having a series of interlinked jobs, which when they review it and when they're in their dotage,
Especially if you're an MP.
Looks like a career, especially if you're an MP. Yes, Mr. Patterson, eat your heart out.
Mr. Cox.
And Mr. Cox, yeah. But the whole thing is trying to identify who really needs a book like this. And it's not, in my view, good enough to say everybody can benefit from it. I do want to particularize it more. So that's why the next book is going to be more designated for people who I would say are between 35 and 50, who acknowledge that they are in a midlife transition period and are looking for direction in the future. But I'm very keen not to call it a midlife crisis, but to term it a midlife or a life opportunity.
You're asking people to look hard at themselves in this book. Some people are very practical, other people are quite introspective. Do you see any dangers of intense introspection?
I think there's a number of answers to that question. The first one is, you notice that I paused before I answered it.
Yes.
Because that is a very personal question to have to answer, because nothing which I would do would be aimed at making people doubt themselves or have negative feelings. So I'm not asking people to be negatively introspective. I'm asking people to, as it were, look in a mirror and see, do I like what I see? And looking through the mirror, and turning a mirror into a window, what possibilities exist in the future. So
Yes.
that's why I paused before I answered it, because I think everybody will have a different response to that question. But if the book creates a situation for people where they look, first of all, look in a mirror, and then the mirror turns into a window, and it has a positive effect in the future, I would be very comfortable with that effect.
One thing I noticed in the book was that there were far more expressions of being positive than negative. And that's what attracted me to the book, because it's definitely glass, half full rather than half empty. And I think that it's the sort of book that people who are, as you say, wandering around at a certain time of life, knowing that they could squeeze a bit more out of themselves, not knowing how to deal with some of life's sort of vicissitudes, ups and downs and all that. And it's the way the book is written clearly and concisely, and you can dip into it. And after every few pages, you really feel as though there's a structure to this, something that you can hang your experiences on. With so many books of the self-help variety, they wander through all sorts of stuff, and you don't know where the hell you are. But this is almost, may I say it, a military book.
Oh, very much so. And
Yes.
if I ask myself the same question, family, school, or business,
Yes.
it is undoubtedly my business, my post-school experiences that I think have shaped me more than anything else. So it's military in the sense of being directive, but not autocratic. It is the sense of setting objectives and having a plan, which is a very military characteristic.
Yes, yes.
But also knowing that your plan, when you bump into the enemy, is going to be ruptured, and you have to think and be flexible and come up with plan B. And that's where many people don't have that ability to initiate plan B. Now, I've developed a thing called Teacup for the English rugby team, thinking clearly under pressure. And what that involved was that scenario planning. And in this scenario, what might we do?
Yes.
And then when you come to an event which resembles the scenario which you've identified, it's never going to be exactly the same, but you have a template to adapt and to move on and come up with a successful plan. But from a military point of view, I'm very proud of the fact that I was taught how to write a plan. I was taught how to identify what your objectives are and to stick with your purpose. And I always give people the double helix identifier. And I want you to imagine the classic DNA double helix. And one of the strands is the chain of command. And the other strand is the chain of purpose. But it is the purpose that is the major identifier for people. If people understand what the purpose, the boss's, the top brass's purpose is, then they are empowered to do it. But the chain of command is very rarely used to tell people what to do, because you are not in a position to actually see what's going on. What the chain of command is best used for is to get information going upwards so that the chain of purpose can be amplified. And I learned this as a very young officer in Borneo, where half the time in the jungle, even with a troop of 30 Marines, I couldn't even see them. Yes. I could see one or two people. And when we did have a contact, I wasn't in a position to tell them what to do. They had to understand the purpose. And I think I became more of a shepherd, hopefully blowing my whistle, as it were, to get them to continue to do what they were doing automatically, because they understood the purpose.
Yes.
I'm reminded of my son being an intern to get some experience in the company that I worked at, actually. Well, a different part from the bit I was running.
Right. Well, wasn't that incestuous?
Absolutely not. No. But anyway, he was very frustrated because they assumed that what you had to do was to give him minute instructions about what to do minute by minute.
Yes.
I said, well, that doesn't make sense at all. And eventually he sort of said, "What are you trying to achieve?"
There we are.
And then they said, well, what do you want to know for?
Yeah, indeed. Well,
And as soon as they said, no, tell me
okay.
what it is you're trying to achieve. So,
Yeah.
right, that's all I need to know. Thank you very much.
Yes, and he could then get on with it.
Absolutely.
Sure, very good. Okay, I think we're going to have a couple more minutes because I think the 20-minute rule is we're nearly there, and 20 minutes is the maximum time we can really concentrate. So perhaps a winding up session, a winding up questions.
No, off to you, Tim.
No, that's you. I've just been flippant. So it's over to you to be constructive.
I think you've done a very good job, Duncan. I was just wondering
Thank you.
whether each time I dip into the book, I like it more and more because there's a lot of experience behind what you say. And I think that it will be something which I hope people will buy. And I wouldn't say that about many of these sort of books because it is so incredibly easy to read. And I think that's one of its great strengths. There is just one aspect that I think you might make slightly more of next time. It's said that, you know, the people who survive are not necessarily the physically the strongest or intellectually the strongest. They're the ones who can actually cope with change. And I think that the ability to cope with change around us is something which you need to concentrate on when you're trying to develop the optimal self.
Well, I think you mentioned to me in the past how the emphasis in many business aspects, which you're still involved in, is not so much putting the emphasis on stress management, but having the confidence to deal with, to develop resilience.
Yes.
And I think that aspect, that slight change of emphasis, I think is something that I'm going to take on board for the future, and to try to acquire some wisdom about the acquisition of resilience. But I've always been reminded, when I use that phrase, of the parable of the oak tree and the reed. And the oak tree was stiff and stern and eventually blew over.
Yes.
But the reed was flexible and moved with the strong winds. And somewhere in between the two is, as it were, the bamboo of this world, which is strong and yet flexible. So I think I need to.
Points well made. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would like to pick up on something that you said earlier about a question, an open question, not expecting any particular one answer, about the dangers of too much introspection. And was there a danger of the same? Because it seems to me that the thing which pervades the whole book is actually an emphasis on knowing yourself, and knowing yourself in a constructive and positive way. And knowing yourself in order to not actually be fazed by challenges from the outside world or indeed from within without understanding them. And so, to my mind, the introspection of it, you can never have too much, in a way, not of the sort that you're encouraging and enabling through dipping in and reading this book.
I think the combination of what you mentioned and what you mentioned about change is a really useful ending point for this discussion, because we've been talking now for 25 minutes, and in that 25 minutes, we've changed. We are not the same people that we were 25 minutes ago. And we've learned from this discussion, I've learned from this discussion, and now, because it's an external discussion with two other people, now is the time that I've got to be introspective and dwell on it and contemplate what has emerged to create tomorrow, to create the future for me and my clients tomorrow. So it's an evolutionary process based on self-knowledge, but how you take that self-knowledge and use it, utilize it for your good and the good of your family, the good of your firm, the good of your club. So I think that as a final point from both of you was really insightful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan.
There we've got it. There's the end of this particular session. Dr. Michael Vaughan, thank you very much indeed. Tim Isaac, a big vote of thanks. and there is the Optimum U. It would make, if I may say, quite a nice Christmas present. Thank you very much.
Shake your hand, Duncan. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.